Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with the last session.
I don't know. Let me.
I think it's been a terrific set of conversations that we've had, and now I guess the culminating closing keynote is going to be from Brett Goldstein. And kind of the two memes of the workshop have been very much along the lines of, you know, what kind of new types of data are there out there that we can collect, and what's the analytical quality. A couple of people also said we should have focused on cost again, but that will be a discussion for another day. Brett is a senior fellow in urban science at the University of Chicago, and has done incredibly interesting work in many areas, and you can Google him. So.
All right. Hi, folks. I am terrified of the last slot of the day. Like, when you're in that sort of last window and the outcome is a reception where there's free food and booze, it's a complete no-win. So hang in there. If you get really bored, I will see where you are and point at you. So I thank you for the intro, and certainly thank you for letting me come talk to you today. I have a completely weird background, and that actually becomes relevant. I grew up in the startup world. I spent 7 years building a company called OpenTable. I was one of the early folks there. I am used to t-shirts and a jeans outfit, so when I put on a suit, I get all nervous, but that is where I did the whole West Coast type of thing. After that, I decided it was important to do public service, so I did the craziest thing that someone could do with my background, and I joined the Chicago Police Department. I was actually a sworn officer. I ended up being a commander of a group that worked in predicting where homicides would occur mathematically. A little different than the OpenTable. And then as I thought I was escaping to another startup, I was recruited by Mayor Rahm Emanuel to be the first chief data officer of a municipality. And rogue iPhone. And so I ended up being the first CDO of Chicago, and I was later on the CIO for the city, and from there I ended up at the University of Chicago. So there's my whole life. And today I want to spend a few minutes talking about this idea of data science and public policy. The fact that we're at this workshop today, did we think we would be at a workshop titled Big Data and Public Policy 10 years ago? This would just be completely crazy. So the fact that there are people here is super awesome. And this is how we need to think about the future. So what's going to happen for the next 25 minutes or so, I'm going to give a little overview, talk about the space, and then I'm going to dive into a few projects. And I want to go that deep because I want people thinking about the things we can do when we bring these worlds together. So the world of urban data. So we have never had so much data before. When we look at government, we realize that, okay, fine, 40, 50 years ago, we had these really interesting things called file cabinets, and there was lots of paper, and that was super awesome, and then we added the whole computer thing to the world, and then lots of printouts, but now we can store data, and we have lots of transactional systems. We have the cloud, you have Amazon EC2, you have all of these different things, and now we have a ton of it, and that's super awesome. And that's the data within government, but at the same time, you have data that's all about the world in which we live in. And honestly, the focus for me today is going to be the urban environment. I care about cities. I really like rural, but that's personal. I focus on cities and how cities work. So in cities, you have all sorts of data. You have city services, which we'll talk about in a minute, incident level data, but then there's this whole thing, and I'm going to give the one caveat now about the use of the term big data. Like, that's a dangerous phrase, right? And sort of, if I were having my CS hat on, I'd get into trouble, definitionally, but we're going to ignore the CS hat today, and we're just going to say big data, even though we're technically talking about larger data. But now you're seeing with cities, you have this bigger data available. A project we have in Chicago is called the Array of Things. Those are fixed place sensors. If you're interested, ask the Googles about it. It's pretty cool. Where you're putting these devices out on corners, and it's a collaboration with the city, and you're getting temperature, environmental, density, all sorts of information, and it's constantly chattering. So this is a U of C City Argonne National Lab collaboration. And wow, all of a sudden you've gone from like dude who works in streets of sanitation making an observation once a day to every couple seconds, you have this whole array of information coming in. Then you have other interesting things like weather data. So I love weather data. Weather data is just awesome. You know, I've spent a lot of time tackling the data that comes from NOAA, which actually is kind of nasty and difficult and things like that. But historically, cities didn't know how to use data like that because it was too hard to work through. And as you make things easier, you're able to do things smarter. So as you wrangle this big data and think about the end user, there's lots of things that become pretty interesting. Now, there's all types of data, and I'm certainly not going to lecture a room that is disqualified on the different types, but you know it. So you have your easy sort of structured data, and then you have aggregated data, and we'll show some nice pictures. But then I started to talk about the sensor data, and we mentioned AOT, we mentioned weather, but think about things like, I think about Chicago, which I know exceptionally well, and you have all of these vehicles that are part of the city system, right? You have buses and garbage trucks and snowplows. Well, they all are censored, right? We have a GPS on every one of them so that every 30 seconds or on a turn, it calls home to mama. And before, we used to be like, okay, that's a lot of data. Let's just delete it every couple weeks and then we'll make room. You know, so I guess, so if my wife were here, so my wife watches a show from time to time called, what's it, Hoarders? I'm kind of a data hoarder. Like, fortunately, there's less social stigma with that, but when please don't tweet that out. So when I went and became the CIO, I said, we're just going to stop deleting, because at the end of the day, space is cheap. In 1999, when we started building OpenTable, I worried about the size of a disk drive, right? Because those were costly in 99. This is now what? We're somewhere in 2015. Space is cheap. You keep it. You learn from it. You do things like that. So you're starting to have all that data in the city. But then you have this whole realm of things that are unstructured. And unstructured data is super awesome. I think there was a text mining or discussion earlier. So I spent a lot of time looking at the Twitters. So super great data, right? But how do you make sense of it? When you have data of that volume, what's your approach? How do you add some structure to it? How do you add some sort of classification so you can get meaning? What are the semantics? Or what is a supervised classifier that you can apply? There's such power in these different sleeves. In the city of Chicago, we started to release data in mass, and this started in 2011. Now, one of the areas I'm exceptionally proud of is incident level crime data. This is a good type of structured data where in 2011 we released every incident from January 1, 2001 to present. So historically, the way of releasing data was you had a map on the police site which had a sort of embedded HTML table, and it would show the past 90 days. And then you'd have someone like every block scrape the data out. Complete silliness. And now we have on the Open Data portal over 5 million records of crime that is available to certainly this cohort, but every cohort, whether it's my mom who wants to check on, ooh, problem in your neighborhood, to a private sector business that wants some intelligence, like Trulia earlier today sent out an email showing sort of crime in neighborhoods. That's an interesting overlay. I am sure that comes from Open Data to researchers. Like, my favorite thing that I have was within a day or two of when we released all of the crime data, I got a tweet from a PhD candidate who said, thank God I can finally finish my dissertation. So that was my big moment in government. Then, you know, certainly, and we're going to talk a little more about mapping in a bit, but with mapping technologies, everything's changed. And we understand the spatial environment in ways we never have before, or it's been in a less accessible way. But the real question, and the question I'd put to the group, but I won't wait for an answer yet, is does this bigger, better urban data lead to better policy decisions? And I think that's a bit of a question mark right now, because we have all of these different worlds. So one of the things I was surprised about was, one, that University of Chicago wanted someone like me. I am not, like, University of Chicago is great, and it's a wonderful school, and I went to grad school there, but I didn't get a PhD, maybe next year. But it has this excellent sort of theoretical practice, or you have like Bob Gerga here from Chapin Hall, who's done some wonderful work at Chapin, but it was less about operational utility. Now, what we learned in 2011 when I did my first foray into being a political appointee for Mayor Emanuel was the old way of saying, here's some data, it's under NDA, get back to me when you have a white paper or a recommendation, had ended. Now, instead, we operate in a world of situational awareness, which a few years ago was a 24-hour news cycle. Now it's like the 2-minute Twitterverse, and you have no time. You can't say, respected researcher X, here's a pile of data, get back to me in a couple of years, because that is great for the researcher, and it's great for the body of knowledge, and it's great for science, but it's very hard to make government smarter in that. And what we're trying to learn is, how do we intersect these worlds without too much compromise? Now, certainly there is compromise between these worlds. So there's this, so my wife, who's a public health scientist, sometimes notices that I like to overwork certain problems. I'll want to potentially overfit a model, I'll want perfection, and she'll constantly say, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And I'm sure we've all heard that quote. And as we find ways to compromise, we all need to learn how to work in that. And often and sort of in hindsight, looking at the slide, I might add another circle which separates out computer science. And I'd add computer science, data science, and policy analysis, and we try and find where is this intersection. And U of C and the Chicago government are wonderful examples. So Harris has a great and wonderful history, like many schools that are out there, in policy, right? Rigorous program, smart faculty, super awesome. Great. When you then talk about dealing with dirty data and sort of operational transactional data, everyone's like, well, that's not so good. So when I put on my CDO-CIO hat, my reality was I had about 1,100 systems, I had billions and billions of rows of data, and it was all just sort of nasty stuff. Like, it's not the clean, wonderful stuff that fits into a case table and makes people feel happy. Or when you look at something like a data set I spent a ton of time with is 911 data. Because when I was with the police department, I argued that we need to look beyond crime data and hear from the public by listening to 911. Because crime is reported crime, and crime has bias within it. And I want to hear what grandma's saying from her third floor window, even if it's unfounded in the crime reports. But it's full of all sorts of junk in there, and that's hard. So how do we bridge these worlds, and how do we then introduce to, when I talk to some faculty who I collaborate at Harris, how do I talk to them about machine learning algorithms and all the things that we've generated on the CS side that can deal with the nonsense? How do we learn the lessons from my friends over at Google and Amazon and LinkedIn and Facebook who are still working on the Valley, who have figured out, like, Amazon has this, all right, I have an Amazon problem. I like buy everything on Amazon. We're talking about diapers to, I have 3 little kids.
Not diapers for me, I'm not that old.
Oh, sorry.
Can we be a little bit more specific?
So we were measuring, I look at, so I measure items of cost based on the amount of diapers I can buy. Because a case of diapers on Amazon is $39.99. You get 4 boxes of diapers with, anyhow, we'll talk about diapers later. But you have, when you log into Amazon and you have a substantial history, they're pretty good at predicting what you want to buy. and they'll show you what you want to buy, and maybe you just hit that one-click shopping. And so there's all this technology and all this mining, which has been super awesome. So how do we bridge that? And so finding the synergies between this is now a focus. And how do you get, when you're in government, so when I'm in Mayor Emanuel's administration or looking at the President's administration, he now is a chief data officer, DJ Patel, who was at LinkedIn before. He was the chief data scientist there. Or in Mayor Bloomberg's administration when they looked at 311, or more recently with the fire code violations. How do you bridge that world? So something we've done at University of Chicago is we built a dual degree program, and that's a program Bob was critical in which we decided to bring together computer science and public policy. And so these students come in, they meet the academic rigor of U of C and of Harris, but they learn how to program. They learn about data science, and then they take the public policy curriculum, because the idea is we need to start to generate students who can work in both worlds. One of the things I found was necessary, I would go from being deep in R, working on a problem, to Mayor Emanuel wants to see you now, put on a tie, give a briefing. There's no longer this excuse that, oh, you work in stats, you work in IT, you work in policy. When the worlds come together, we actually do this smarter, near real-time decision making. And if you couple that with a change in tools, like how many people here use R? See, you're a good group. So if you went to a typical city hall in 2011 and you said, why can't you do advanced data analytics? What would the answer be? It would be, we can't afford it. Because if I'm going to buy SPSS before IBM acquired it, they'd say it's $14,000 a seat. And you're right, they could not afford it. But wow, you can get on the interwebs and download R for the cost of nothing, and you can do something that's really smart. And what we did at City Hall was we had U of C give us some grad students, and we taught R classes. And that was considered completely nuts. But now when you talk to municipalities out there, because I got Bloomberg's administration to do it, we have taken the we can't afford the tools discussion off of the table. Now we think more about pipeline. How do I supply students fresh out of school who can work on these types of problems? The landscape has changed. The opportunity is huge, and the demand is there. It's just you're seeing these key leaders get beyond the rhetoric of data-driven solution or evidence-based, whatever. They actually want to do it, and they have the data. Now we need to empower them. So some projects I want people to think about, because I'm going to pick up the pace a bit, that are percolating at U of C, that show how you bring things together and how we as a group can contribute better to the field. We have a project called Plenaria. So everyone here in the room is familiar with open data, right? Is there anyone who doesn't know open data? Don't raise your hand. Good. So there's all that, we did this great job of releasing open data. And it became like a government thing. Oh, we made it open. We're going to get a press release, and we're transparent, and we're wonderful, and all that. And that is great. But you hit a point where, I said this in like 2012 or 2013, that it's essentially just spreadsheets on the web. And it's fine to release it, but how do you make it usable? Now, historically, my focus has been on spatially enabled data, because I care about spatially enabled data, and I tend to care about financial data. Focusing on spatially enabled data, I found it counterintuitive that if I'm trying to grab this data, I would then have to join it together, build some sort of spatial index, and work on projects like that. So what we did in Plenaria is we built this open source backend, so everything's up on GitHub. And it's a partnership between Charlie Catlett and myself. We got an NSF grant, and MacArthur helped with this. And we built this massive spatial index that what it does, and I will go a little technical for a second, it runs ETLs, so extract jobs, into all of the spatially enabled open data portals it can find. And then it regularly sucks it into this pretty large PostGIS implementation up in AWS. Now, why do this? Because I want to be able to answer the question, tell me everything you know about this location. So if I'm a researcher and I'm trying to build a case table and I want to know everything about 121 North LaSalle, City Hall in Chicago, I don't have to shop around. Like, it drives me nuts. There was that article in the New York Times that talked about, 80% of all data science work is data prep. Okay, great, that's good. We publish that out and we have lots of unicorns and that's wonderful, but we need to move on. We need to make data easier. So what Planario does is it brings it together and it offers it up all via an API. And as you can see, this takes in data sets from all over the US, or what we haven't found, you just tell us about it and it starts to consume it. Now, we've tried to architect this for a variety of users. You have I always pick on my mom, which will never listen to this, so we're good. So we built a mapping layer on top with the intent to not get into the mapping business, but to show you can build an ad hoc polygon, you can have data and temporal attributes, and you get all the data you want. And that is one-stop shopping for that case table example. And when you think about things, you start to say, there are really interesting combinations that you can make. So maybe show me all the homicides in Chicago when an arrest was made. Or show me the weather circumstances when there was a car accident. Now, for those of you who go back to my NOAA statement earlier on, you'd say, wow, if I were trying to answer the question of all car accidents on